I am Sarah Peterson. I grew up in a kitchen that smelled like dill, brisket, and black tea boiled until it tasted like consolation. My father, Ian, came from Russia. Hard laugh, softer hands. An agnostic who taught me how to fix a leaky faucet and how to swear in 2 languages for maximum emphasis. My mother, Elaine, kept the holiday table like a small, stubborn shrine to memory. She called herself religiously agnostic and culturally Jewish, which meant the rituals mattered even if the theology didn't. That kitchen is where my life learned its shape. The rules, the exceptions, the places you got to push, and the places you didn't. We haven't spoken properly in years. It wasn't a cinematic blowout. It was a series of small refusals that calcified. I refused to follow the life track everyone expected. I didn't go to yeshiva prep classes. I dated people who weren't approved. I stopped answering the prayer book invites with the right cadence of guilt. Over time, the calls became fewer, then polite, then non-existent. When I moved to LA, it felt like exile, and exile felt like freedom. I built a life there, a modest apartment with a tiny balcony, a job that paid the rent, friends who felt like chosen family. I also built my future with Henry Washington. He's steady in a way that shades into stubborn kindness. He makes coffee the same way every morning, reads the newspaper like it's a compass, and laughs with his whole chest. Henry is black, which I did not hide from anyone who mattered. Except, it turned out, my parents. I flew back to New York because I wanted the things you only ever get by showing up. Reconciliation, if it was possible, and my parents' faces in the room when I asked them to come to my wedding. This was not only about ceremony. It was about permission, or at least awareness, for the life I was choosing. So Henry and I took a taxi through a rain-shushed Manhattan, our suitcases bumping like nervous percussion, and rehearsed small talk the way you rehearse a difficult toast. He was calm, a little amused, like every fresh awkwardness was an anthropological field trip. I was a wire, part hope, part dread, thinking about what might be asked, what might be forgiven, what might never be. When we reached the brownstone where I grew up, my hands knew the groove of the brass knocker even before my brain remembered which pattern to tap. Ian opened the door first. Time does things to faces. Dust settles differently on memory than on bone, but he was still my father. The same shoulders, the same habitual half-smile. Behind him, like a visual intake of breath, was my mother, Elaine. Her eyes widened in a way that made the whole hallway feel smaller. She had the tablecloth rehearsed composure of someone who commemorates everything, even when she is pretending not to. "Sarah?" she said, as if testing whether the name had the right weight to it. Then she saw Henry. He stepped forward with the kind of quiet confidence that made the hair on my arm stand up. He offered a hand and a smile that aimed to be disarming. For a fraction of a second, the hallway held only the sound of rain and the small echo of our suitcases. Then Elaine's face changed. Not a flicker, a rearrangement. She looked at Henry like someone who had been handed a line in a play she didn't know the ending to. "But he's black," Elaine said. The syllables were clipped, precise. A small bomb dropped in a narrow corridor. A fling would be bad enough, but marriage? Not in this house. My mouth went dry. Henry's hand hovered, then dropped. Ian's smile thinned into something I'd only seen when he was thinking too hard about compromise. I felt the room tilt, and for a moment I was 12 again, watching my mother measure out rules the way she measured sugar. Heaping, exact, impossible to unmeasure. Henry blinked like the punchline to a joke that hadn't landed yet and then smiled. The kind of smile that says he's cataloging this moment for later, like a museum piece. "Well," he said, voice smooth, "I've never met someone who was honestly opposed to my race before. This is new. Every new thing is kind of fun, right?" He said it light, which made the edges of everything loosen for a second. My insides unknotted a notch. Henry has this way of disarming with an easy curiosity. It's why I fell in love with him. He could make a tax seminar sound like an adventure if he wanted to. For once, I wanted him to be angry, to be indignant on my behalf, but the calm in him is a tether I had already decided to trust. Elaine stood with the door half closed behind her like she could bar the world out if she wished. "Fun?" she repeated, and then, because she was always a woman who manufactured protocol out of panic, she stepped aside and invited us in. Ian gave me that small, sheepish nod of his, the one that says he's sorry this is happening, but not sure what else to do. We took our coats off in that kitchen that smelled the same as it always had. Warm fat from the last roast, a citrus note from a dish soap she never changed, a faint thread of the candle wax she kept for holidays she'd always insist were important even if the prayers weren't. Dinner was intentional in its awkwardness. Elaine moved food like she was arranging defenses on a strategic map. A platter of brisket halfway between us, a bowl of roasted root vegetables she pretended weren't there for show, a salad that she watched like a hawk to make sure we appreciated its salt. Henry took it all with small, polite gratitude, and tried a few jokes that landed like stones skipping on still water. I kept glancing at him, watching the way his jaw worked when he chose his words. Ian tried to keep the conversation light. He asked Henry where he worked, what part of the city he grew up in, if he liked jazz. Henry does. Elaine asked other things. They weren't small questions dressed in curiosity. They were interrogation in a cardigan. "Do you have a history of violence?" she asked bluntly. Henry blinked, then laughed, not meanly but incredulously. "No, never once in my life," he said. Elaine's brow lowered, as though the mere mention of the possibility had reassured her that she had asked the question. It felt like being handed a bandage for a wound that hadn't been there. "Did your father abandon you?" she asked next, as though she were reading a checklist of character shorthand. Henry answered, "His parents are happily married. They've been together decades." Elaine's eyes narrowed and then softened with all the complexity of a woman who had cataloged every family failure and success like stamps in a book. The questions zipped from personal to political, with the reckless momentum of something that had been rehearsed in private. "Do you support Israel or," she faltered, the word heavy and dangerous, "Hamas?" Henry's face didn't tighten the way I'd feared it would. He answered that he didn't think either government had found a moral way forward, and that he hoped for peace. The remark hung there, heavy and unsatisfying for her, like soup without salt. Every question was a probe, and every probe was a test I hadn't known she would grade me on. Sometimes she sounded like she was protecting me from a threat I hadn't perceived. Other times, she sounded like she was protecting her idea of me from being stolen. Ian would throw in a joke, a neutral fact, some domestic anecdote, and for a moment you could see Elaine trying to take the safe route, wanting to be mother who applauds a daughter's choices. But anxiety rewired her into something else mid-sentence. Henry handled it with that patient, direct manner that makes people either adore him or resent him for being unruffled. He laughed on cue when she tried to be funny, deflected the nastier inquiries with calm facts, and occasionally asked a question back that forced her to say more than she planned. At one point, he looked at me and said, quietly, "Maybe I can charm her. Dinner seems like a good start." I wanted to believe him so badly that my heart did one of those ridiculous, hopeful flips. I kept trying to smooth things over. I asked about her new curtains, about the yarmulke my grandfather used to keep in the drawer. I wanted ritual to be a bridge tonight. But ritual had been the wedge that had driven us apart. Elaine muttered sometimes under her breath, thin sentences that might have been prayers or might have been rehearsed objections. Ian retreated into the role of mediator, which is what he does best. He takes two things and, with an exasperated smile, tries to tape them together. At one point, as the conversation looped and circled like a wary animal, Elaine reached for the one thing she thought might still anchor what she believed about me. "So, you know he's marrying a Jewish girl, right?" she asked Henry, like that was the hinge on which everything turned. The question widened into the room, and for a second I could hear my own breath like a third voice at the table. Henry paused, looked at me, looked at my parents, and smiled the kind of smile that said, "I'm not the villain here. Yet." He opened his mouth to answer, but what he said next is the thing that will have to wait. When Elaine asked if Henry was okay with marrying a Jewish girl, the room folded in on itself like a map being refolded the wrong way. Henry looked at me the way people look at the person who handed them the surprise party cake. Part amusement, part readiness to help sweep up the mess. He opened his mouth, and I stopped him. "I didn't tell you. I said, and the words felt clumsy and too loud in the kitchen that had once been the scale of my life. I converted to Islam a while ago. The ceremony was private. We decided to raise our kids Muslim. Silence made a small, brittle sound. Henry's smile slid like a calm hand across the storm and settled. "Oh," he said simply, steady as a heartbeat. "Okay." Elaine's face went through weather patterns I could predict down to the minute. First came disbelief, the slightly incredulous lift of her eyebrows. Then a roiling, private calculation. What this meant for rituals, for identity, for grandchildren, for the family line she'd been rehearsing for decades. Her fingers tightened around the fork she wasn't eating with anymore, and she made a sound that was half laugh and half spasm. "Leave," she said before she'd fully let herself decide. Not a request, an edict, like one of the rules she'd been raised on. She stood as if the word itself had the power to remove us from her house. Ian's eyes flicked to mine, and for a moment I saw that place where he measured damage and figured out the math of apology. Elaine's breath came fast now. She muttered fragments I couldn't catch, Hebrew maybe, or a list of grievances she'd been saving like stamps. Then, abruptly, she walked back to the sink and began rinsing a plate as if the motion could steady her. "Stay," she said, contradictory, softer, the kind of command a person who is afraid of endings makes when they crave control. She was a woman split into committees, one part furious, one part curious, one part mother who wanted her daughter near, even if the map had changed. Ian took her hand and led her toward the bedroom. They spoke low, too low for me to parse the words. I could hear the muffled cadence of them arguing, then less of an argument and more of an old couple's chorus of fear and love. When the bedroom door clicked shut, it sounded like someone putting a lid on a pot in the middle of being boiled. Henry turned to me then, and I could see the question in his face. Not about doctrine, but about me. Had I reckoned with what this would cost? I felt suddenly like a thief caught with the family silver. "I thought you told them," he said quietly. "I thought you knew," I answered. My voice was small in the kitchen, brittle as a stained glass shard. "I meant to. I planned it 1,000 ways in my head and then didn't. I'm sorry. I should have told them." He crossed the room and took my hand. His touch was an uncomplicated geography. "Okay," he said, and the simplicity of that single word felt larger than anything Elaine had said that night. "We'll handle it. Together." After a while, Ian came out first. His face was the softened thing I'd always loved, the man who would sooner take the blame than let a crack widen. He spoke to Henry like he was talking to a son he'd only just gained. Practical, a little embarrassed, wrapping warmth around awkwardness. Then Elaine followed, hands tucked into the pockets of the cardigan she used as armor. Her mouth was a line. She looked older in that moment, not from time, but from a kind of reckoning. "I won't hassle you about the marriage," she said, which, translated from Elaine speak, meant, "This is not my approval, but I will not make this night into a battleground." Her voice held something like relief, not because she'd accepted everything, but because the path forward felt less like an assault and more like a negotiation. It was a small surrender and a larger truce. I invited them to the wedding like I was handing over a fragile, important object. "Please come," I said. "We want you there." Elaine's jaw worked with a calculation that had nothing to do with the heat of the moment. She remembered dresses, the smell of her mother's candles, the pattern of chairs set for people with names she'd known since childhood. I watched her weigh those memories against the newness I represented. Slowly, with the careful deliberation of someone adjusting to a new prescription, she nodded. "Yes," she said. "I'll come." It wasn't triumphant. It was not a bow or a concession. It was a realignment, like the settling of a house after an earthquake. She smiled. Thin, but real. And for the first time that night, I saw something like happiness in her eyes. Relieved and complicated and very human. Ian reached out and squeezed my arm, his face offering the kind of quiet apology that can't be wrapped in words. We stayed through coffee that Elaine made and biscuits she buttered without ceremony, as if by continuing the small domestic rites she could stitch us back together. Conversation picked at threads that hadn't been frayed yet. The mundane, the safe, the slightly absurd stories that make small talk into something like truce. Henry told a story about a jazz club he'd loved, Ian told one about a sink he'd fixed. Elaine listened, sometimes frowning, sometimes laughing, and sometimes looking at me with the complex pride and worry only a mother can hold. When we left that night, the hallway felt the same as when we'd walked in. The same brass, the same echo. But the air had shifted. The knot we'd brought with us hadn't been entirely untied, but the rope was no longer being pulled taut across the room. There was room to breathe, and, more dangerously, room to hope. Outside, Henry squeezed my hand and we stepped into the wet porch light. "Thank you," he said, not grandly, just steady, "for telling the truth." I thought of all the versions of me that I'd been, of small rebellions and big exits, and the way coming home had always felt like testing whether the shape I'd made for myself would fit the frame my parents had kept. For once, the fit felt possible. Not perfect, not seamless, but honest. We walked away together into the rain-washed street, suitcase wheels whispering like a second heartbeat. The city hummed around us, indifferent and vast and full of chance. I thought of the wedding, of vows, of future children, of a life that would require 1,000 small disclosures, some tender, some brutal. I felt strangely like a person stepping off a cliff who'd remembered midway that she could fly.